The rain hammered against the kitchen window of our suburban Atlanta home as I stared at the divorce papers scattered across the granite countertop. My hands trembled as I read the same paragraph for the third time, the legal jargon blurring through my tears. 23 years of marriage, reduced to cold, clinical language about asset division and custody arrangements. You're really going through with this melodrama? David's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He stood in the doorway, his expensive suit still pressed despite the long day at his law firm. His dark eyes held no warmth, no recognition of the woman he'd once promised to love and cherish. I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand, tasting salt. Melodrama? David, this is our marriage ending. Our family falling apart. Our daughter. Jessica is 18. She's heading to college in 2 months. She'll be fine. He walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, popping it open with practiced ease. Besides, she's always been more attached to you anyway. The casual cruelty in his tone made my stomach clench. This was the man I'd met in law school, the one who used to bring me coffee during all-nighters in the library. The one who held my hand during Jessica's difficult birth, who cried with joy when she took her first steps in this very kitchen. When did you become so cold? The words escaped before I could stop them. David took a long swig of his beer and actually smiled a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't become anything, Rebecca. I just stopped pretending that this suburban fantasy was enough for me. Fantasy! I stood up, my chair scraping against the tile floor. Our life together was a fantasy. Come on. He gestured around the kitchen with his beer bottle. The perfect little house, the perfect little wife, the perfect little daughter. It's all so ordinary. He practically spat the last word. The contempt in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all those years I'd worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer so I could be there for Jessica's school events, soccer games, homework help. All those evenings I'd made his favorite meals, listened to his work stories, supported his ambitions. All those nights I'd fallen asleep alone while he worked late or claimed to. Is this about her? I asked quietly. Your secretary, sorry, your associate. David's jaw tightened. Vanessa is brilliant. She understands ambition, success. She doesn't see it as a betrayal of some domestic ideal. There it was, the confirmation I'd been dreading for months. The late nights, the weekend conferences, the distant looks, the way he'd started treating our home like a hotel he was merely passing through. How long? My voice was barely a whisper. Does it matter? He set down his beer and straightened his tie. The point is I'm done. I'm 46 years old, Rebecca. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in this suburban prison. Prison. That's what he called the life we'd built together. The home where Jessica had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where we'd hosted Christmas dinners for his parents, where I'd nursed him through pneumonia 3 years ago. I felt something break inside me then, not just my heart, but something deeper. My sense of reality, maybe. The foundation of everything I believed about us. I gave you everything, I whispered. David actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that seemed to echo off the kitchen walls. Everything. You gave me a mortgage and a minivan, Rebecca. You gave me routine and mediocrity. The tears came harder now, and I didn't try to stop them. 23 years of marriage, of partnership, of building a life together, and this was how he saw it. How he saw me. Stop crying, he said, his voice edged with irritation. It's pathetic. Pathetic. I looked up at him through my tears. I'm grieving the end of my marriage, the end of our family, and you think that's pathetic? I think it's dramatic. This was inevitable, Rebecca. Surely you felt it too, how we've grown apart, how different we've become. Different. I wiped my eyes with a dish towel, trying to compose myself. You're the one who changed, David. You're the one who decided that everything we built wasn't enough. Because it wasn't. His voice rose for the first time, revealing a flash of the anger he'd been keeping controlled. Do you know what it's like to feel trapped? To feel like you're suffocating in your own life. So you decided to blow it all up instead of talking to me? Instead of trying to work through it together. Work through it. He shook his head. Rebecca, there's nothing to work through. We want different things. We are different people. I want more than this small-town life, and you're content with it. The word content sounded like an accusation in his mouth. I thought about Jessica upstairs, probably doing homework or video chatting with her friends, oblivious to the fact that her parents were systematically dismantling everything she'd known as home. I thought about the photo albums in the living room, filled with family vacations, holidays, birthdays, all the moments that David now seemed to view as evidence of his imprisonment. "What about Jessica?" I asked. "What about her? She's leaving for Northwestern in August. She'll have her own life. She's our daughter, David. She deserves to have parents who can at least be civil to each other." "I am being civil." His tone was defensive now. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable in the divorce. You can keep the house, most of the savings. I just want out. Want out. Like our marriage was a contract he was canceling, not a life we built together." I looked around the kitchen, at the coffee maker we'd bought together when we'd first moved in, at the refrigerator covered with Jessica's artwork from elementary school, at the window where I'd watched David teach her to shoot hoops in the driveway. Every corner of this house held memories, and he wanted to walk away from all of it. "I never meant to hold you back," I said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, then maybe regret, maybe recognition of the woman he'd once loved. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "I know," he said, his voice softer, "but that doesn't change anything." He finished his beer and set the empty bottle on the counter. "I'm staying at Vanessa's tonight. My lawyer will be in touch about scheduling mediation." Just like that, 23 years reduced to scheduling mediation. As he walked toward the door, I found my voice again. "David!" He turned back, impatience already creeping back into his expression. "When you look back on all this someday, I hope you remember that I loved you. Really loved you. Even when you couldn't love me back anymore." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something almost like pain cross his features. But then he straightened his shoulders and gave me that cold, professional smile. "Goodbye, Rebecca." The front door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life he was so eager to leave behind, and cried for everything we'd lost and everything he'd chosen to throw away. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean for whatever came next. 3 weeks later, I sat across from David in the sterile conference room of his lawyer's downtown Atlanta office, 27 floors above the bustling streets. The city sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, all glass and steel and ambition, everything David claimed he wanted instead of our quiet suburban life. My attorney, Patricia Mills, shuffled through documents beside me. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, recommended by my college roommate who'd gone through her own brutal divorce 2 years earlier. "Don't let them intimidate you," she'd warned me. "David's got home field advantage, but that doesn't mean he gets to dictate terms." David sat beside his lawyer, James Hartford, a man I recognized from firm holiday parties. They'd worked together for years, which gave David yet another advantage in this process that already felt stacked against me. He looked confident, relaxed even, in his charcoal gray suit. The same suit he'd worn to Jessica's high school graduation just 2 months ago. "Let's start with the house," Hartford said, opening a thick folder. "My client is prepared to be generous. Mrs. Walker can keep the property, along with the associated mortgage payments." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Generous? The house was purchased with joint funds during the marriage. It's marital property." "Of course," Hartford smiled smoothly. "But given that Mr. Walker has been the primary breadwinner throughout the marriage, and considering his future earning potential versus Mrs. Walker's part-time freelance income." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Part-time freelance income. As if the choice to work less hadn't been a decision we'd made together, so I could be present for Jessica's childhood, so I could manage the household, so I could support David's demanding career. "My client reduced her working hours to support the family unit," Patricia countered. "That was a joint decision that benefited Mr. Walker's career advancement." David leaned forward. "I never asked Rebecca to limit her career." The words hit me like a slap. I stared at him across the polished conference table, remembering all the conversations we'd had about my working less. When Jessica was born and daycare costs would have eaten most of my entry-level designer salary. When she started school and someone needed to be available for pickups and sick days and parent conferences. When David's cases became more demanding and he needed someone to handle everything at home. "That's not how I remember it," I said quietly. David's eyes met mine for the first time since we'd sat down. Remember it however you want, Rebecca. The fact is, you chose to prioritize other things over your career. Other things. Like raising our daughter. Like being his partner. Hartford continued as if I hadn't spoken. Now, regarding spousal support, given the length of the marriage and the disparity in earning capacity, my client is willing to provide temporary alimony for a period of 5 years. 5 years. Patricia's voice sharpened. Mrs. Walker supported her husband's career for over 2 decades. She's entitled to what the law provides, Hartford interrupted. And 5 years is more than generous for someone who can return to full-time work. I thought about my portfolio, such as it was. A few logo designs for local businesses, some brochures for Jessica's school fundraisers, websites for friends starting small businesses. How do you explain to a judge that supporting your family's life was a full-time job that didn't come with a resume or references? There's also the matter of retirement accounts, Hartford continued. Mr. Walker's 401k and pension are substantial, built over his entire career. The numbers they threw around made my head spin. Assets and debts, percentages and calculations. Everything we built together reduced to line items on a spreadsheet. What about Jessica's college expenses? I asked during a brief break. David looked up from his phone. What about them? She has a partial scholarship to Northwestern. The rest is manageable. Manageable for who? I felt my composure starting to crack. My freelance income certainly can't cover what the scholarship doesn't. Then maybe you should have thought about that before letting your career stagnate, David said coolly. Patricia placed a warning hand on my arm, but I was past caring about strategy. Let my career stagnate. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. I supported your career, David. I made it possible for you to work 70-hour weeks, to travel for depositions, to schmooze with partners at weekend golf tournaments. I handled everything at home so you could focus on becoming successful. And I'm grateful for that, David replied, his tone so patronizing it made my teeth clench. But that was your choice. I can't be held financially responsible for your choices indefinitely. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 27 floors below. I stared at this man I'd been married to for 23 years, this stranger wearing David's face, and wondered when he'd become so cruel. Your choices, I repeated quietly. Is that how you see our entire marriage? As a series of my poor choices? David's jaw tightened. I see it as 2 people who wanted different things and pretended otherwise for too long. I never pretended anything, I said. I loved our life. I loved being Jessica's mother, being your wife. I thought you did too. Then you weren't paying attention. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Patricia squeezed my arm gently, reminding me we were in a negotiation, not a therapy session. But how do you negotiate with someone who views your entire shared history as a mistake? Let's take a 15-minute break, Hartford suggested, probably sensing the tension that was making the air in the conference room feel thick and heavy. David immediately pulled out his phone and stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass wall, I could see him talking animatedly to someone, probably Vanessa. The woman who understood his ambition, who saw success as something to celebrate rather than something that might threaten the balance of a family. Don't let him get to you, Patricia said quietly. This is exactly what he wants, to make you emotional, to make you look unstable. Unstable! I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm not the one who blew up a 23-year marriage for a woman young enough to be his daughter. How young? 28. The number still made me feel sick. She's 6 years older than Jessica. Patricia made a note on her legal pad. That might be relevant if we can establish a pattern of inappropriate behavior or poor judgment. I watched David through the glass, saw him smile at whatever the person on the phone was saying. When was the last time he'd smiled like that at me? When was the last time he'd looked at me with anything other than irritation or indifference? He used to laugh at my jokes, I said, not realizing I'd spoken aloud until Patricia looked up at me. I'm sorry. Nothing. I straightened in my chair. What do we do next? We counter their offer. The alimony duration is insulting, and they know it. We'll ask for 10 years, settle for 8. The retirement account division is standard, but we'll push for a larger percentage given your contributions to his career success. Contributions to his career success. It sounded so clinical, so removed from the reality of what those contributions had been. The dinners I'd cooked while he worked late. The school events I'd attended alone because he had depositions. The social obligations I'd handled because he was too tired or too busy. The way I'd made our home a sanctuary where he could rest and recharge between the battles of his professional life. David returned to the conference room, his phone conversation finished. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful. The contrast to my own emotional state was stark and humiliating. Ready to continue? Hartford asked. For the next 2 hours, they picked apart our marriage like forensic accountants, assigning monetary value to everything we'd shared. The furniture we'd chosen together. The car I drove that was technically in both our names. Even Jessica's college fund, which I contributed to with my part-time freelance income for 18 years. By the time we finished, I felt hollowed out, scraped raw. Every aspect of our life together had been reduced to dollars and cents, to who deserved what and who was entitled to how much. We'll review your counterproposal and respond within the week, Hartford said as we gathered our papers. David stood and straightened his tie. Rebecca, he said as I reached the door. I turned back, hoping for something in acknowledgement of what this was costing both of us, maybe a recognition that this process was tearing apart more than just assets. Try not to drag this out unnecessarily, he said. It's better for everyone if we can resolve this quickly and move on. Move on. As if 23 years of marriage was something you could simply step over like a puddle on the sidewalk. I didn't trust myself to respond. Instead, I walked out of that sterile conference room and into the elevator, where I finally allowed myself to cry for everything we were losing and everything David seemed so eager to leave behind. The elevator descended 27 floors, carrying me away from the world of glass and steel and ambition, back down to ground level where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, and sometimes, apparently, that had to be enough. The courtroom smelled like old wood and bitter coffee, with fluorescent lights that cast everything in an unforgiving glare. I sat beside Patricia at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. Across the aisle, David looked perfectly composed in his navy suit, whispering something to Hartford that made both men smile grimly. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes, reviewed the case file while we waited. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the scratch of a court reporter's fingers on her machine. This is a dissolution of marriage case, Judge Morrison began, looking over her reading glasses at both parties. I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and I understand there are disputes regarding spousal support duration and asset division. That's correct, Your Honor, Hartford stood smoothly. My client, Mr. Walker, has made what we believe to be generous offers, considering the circumstances. Mrs. Walker, Judge Morrison addressed me directly. You're seeking extended spousal support. Can you explain your position? I stood on unsteady legs. Patricia had coached me for this moment, but facing the judge's direct gaze made my throat feel dry as dust. Your Honor, I supported my husband's career for 23 years. I reduced my own working hours to manage our household and raise our daughter, which allowed Mr. Walker to focus entirely on building his practice. I believe I'm entitled to support that reflects the sacrifices I made for our family's benefit. Judge Morrison nodded and made a note. Mr. Walker, you dispute this characterization? David rose, and for a moment he looked like the man I'd married, confident, articulate, in command of any room he entered. Your Honor, while I appreciate my wife's contributions to our household, the decision to limit her career was ultimately hers. I'm willing to provide reasonable support for a reasonable duration, but not indefinite alimony based on choices she made independently. The familiar sting of his words hit me again. Choices I made independently, as if our marriage had been a business arrangement where I'd made poor investments. I'd like to call a witness, Patricia said, standing. Jessica Walker, the couple's daughter. My heart lurched. Jessica was home from her first semester at Northwestern, and Patricia had suggested she might testify about our family dynamic. But seeing my 18-year-old daughter walk into that courtroom, her dark hair pulled back severely and her young face set in determined lines, made this all feel suddenly devastatingly real. Jessica, Patricia began gently after the swearing-in was complete. Can you describe your parents' roles in your upbringing? Jessica's voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the witness stand. Mom was always there. Every school event, every soccer game, every time I was sick or needed help with homework. Dad worked a lot. He tried to be present, but his job came first. Did your parents ever discuss the arrangement of your mother working part-time? All the time, Jessica said, her voice gaining strength. Dad would say things like, "Thank God Mom can handle the school pickup," or I couldn't take this case if Mom wasn't managing everything at home. It wasn't like Mom just decided on her own. They talked about it, and Dad always said it made sense for the family. I saw David shift uncomfortably in his chair, but Hartford quickly stood for cross-examination. "Jessica, you love your mother very much, don't you?" "Yes." Her voice was cautious now. "And you'd want to see her taken care of financially?" "I'd want to see both my parents treated fairly. But you were a child during most of these conversations you mentioned. Isn't it possible you misunderstood the context or the decision-making process?" Jessica's eyes flashed. She had David's intelligence and my stubborn streak. "I'm 18, not 8. I understood that Dad's career required Mom to sacrifice hers. I understood that she made that sacrifice willingly because she loved us both." Hartford pressed on. "Did you ever hear your father pressure your mother to work less?" "He didn't have to pressure her," Jessica said quietly. "She loved us enough to do it without being asked." The simple truth of it hung in the courtroom air. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to give David the satisfaction of seeing me break down again. But then Hartford made a mistake. "Jessica, are you aware that your father has moved on? That he's found happiness with someone who supports his ambitions rather than limiting them?" The question was clearly meant to suggest that I had been holding David back, but it backfired spectacularly. Jessica's face went white, then red. "Are you asking me if I know about Vanessa? About how Dad was cheating on Mom for months before he filed for divorce? About how he brought her to his office Christmas party last year and introduced her as his associate while Mom was at home planning his surprise birthday party?" The courtroom erupted. Hartford objected, Patricia responded, and Judge Morrison called for order. But the damage was done, or rather, the truth was out. Through the chaos, I saw David's face. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he looked shaken. "Caught." Judge Morrison restored order and dismissed Jessica, who walked past both our tables with her chin held high. She'd inherited the best of both David and me. I realized his intelligence and my sense of justice. "I'd like to call another witness," Patricia said. "Vanessa Chun." My stomach dropped. David's face went ashen. Hartford was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Miss Chen's relationship with my client began after the separation." "Actually," Patricia said smoothly, "I have evidence suggesting otherwise. Miss Chen worked as Mr. Walker's associate for 2 years before the separation was filed." Judge Morrison's expression grew stern. "I'll allow it, but keep it relevant to the financial matters at hand." Vanessa entered the courtroom like she owned it all, sleek black hair and expensive suit, her confidence radiating outward. She was beautiful in a sharp, professional way that made me acutely aware of every one of my 45 years. Under Patricia's questioning, a different story emerged. Vanessa admitted to working late with David frequently over the past 2 years. She confirmed they'd traveled together to conferences. She acknowledged that their relationship had evolved while David was still married. "Miss Chun," Patricia asked, "did Mr. Walker ever discuss his marriage with you during the time you worked together?" Vanessa glanced nervously at David. "Sometimes." "What did he say about his wife?" "He said—" She paused, clearly uncomfortable. "He said she didn't understand his ambitions, that she was content with a small life and didn't support his goals for the future." Each word felt like a knife twist, but Patricia pressed on. "Did he ever mention that his wife had sacrificed her own career to support his?" "He said she chose to work part-time." "Did he acknowledge that this choice benefited his career?" Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. "He said it was convenient for the family arrangement." "Convenient," Patricia repeated. "And did you and Mr. Walker begin a personal relationship while he was still married?" The courtroom was dead silent. Vanessa looked at David, at Hartford, at the judge. Finally, quietly, she answered, "Yes." The words seemed to echo in the air. David's face had gone completely white now, his careful composure finally shattered. Judge Morrison called a recess, and I stumbled out into the hallway, my legs feeling like jelly. Jessica was waiting for me, and she immediately pulled me into a fierce hug. "I'm sorry I had to say all that in there, Mom. But someone needed to tell a truth." "Oh, sweetheart." I held her tight, this brave daughter who'd grown up too fast in the past few months. "You did the right thing." When we reconvened, Judge Morrison's demeanor had noticeably changed. She questioned David directly about the timeline of his relationship with Vanessa, about his claims regarding our mutual decisions about my career, about his characterization of our marriage as limiting his ambitions. David, for the first time in months, seemed at a loss for words. The confident attorney, who could argue any case, was reduced to fumbling explanations and defensive responses. "Mr. Walker," Judge Morrison said finally, "you've portrayed your wife as someone who independently chose to limit her career and is now seeking undeserved support. But the testimony suggests a very different picture. A woman who made sacrifices to support her family while her husband pursued not just professional advancement, but personal relationships outside the marriage." Hartford tried to object, but Judge Morrison continued. "Furthermore, your characterization of your marriage as mutually unsatisfying is contradicted by the evidence of your own infidelity and your wife's continued commitment to the family unit." She looked at both of us then, her expression stern but not unkind. This court sees divorce cases every day. We see couples who've grown apart, who've made mistakes, who've simply reached the end of their road together. What we don't often see is this level of contempt for a spouse who, by all accounts, fulfilled her role in the marriage partnership with dedication and sacrifice. David flinched as if he'd been slapped. "Mrs. Walker," Judge Morrison addressed me directly, "you've conducted yourself with dignity throughout these proceedings. You've been honest about your contributions to the marriage and realistic about your needs going forward. Your daughter's testimony makes it clear that your career decisions were made jointly and for the benefit of the entire family." She turned back to David, and her voice grew cold. "Mr. Walker, your attempt to rewrite the history of your marriage to justify your actions and minimize your obligations is both transparent and deeply unfair to a woman who supported your success for over 2 decades. The final judgment was swift and decisive. 8 years of spousal support, a larger percentage of the retirement accounts, full coverage of Jessica's remaining college expenses. But more than the financial victory, it was Judge Morrison's final words that would stay with me forever. In 20 years on this bench, I've seen many marriages end, but rarely have I seen such a clear example of one spouse acting with dignity while the other abandoned not just their marriage vows, but basic human decency. Mrs. Walker, you deserve better than what you've received in this courtroom, and certainly better than what you received in your marriage." David never looked at me as we left the courtroom. But as I walked out into the Atlanta afternoon with Jessica's arm linked through mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: vindication. Not just legally, but personally. The judge had seen the truth that David had tried so hard to obscure. She'd recognized the woman I'd been, the sacrifices I'd made, the dignity I'd maintained even when everything I'd believed about my life was falling apart. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the bathroom of my new apartment, getting ready for what Patricia called the most important job interview of my life. The apartment was smaller than our old house, a 2-bedroom in Virginia Highland that Jessica and I had chosen together during her winter break. But it felt like mine in a way that house never had after David left. The woman in the mirror looked different than the one who'd sat crying over divorce papers a year ago. My hair was shorter, styled in a way that felt both professional and confident. I'd lost the stress weight that had crept on during the worst months, and the sleepless nights had finally given way to something resembling peace. "Mom, you've got this," Jessica called from the living room. She was home for spring break, spending it helping me prepare for this interview instead of going to Cabo with her sorority sisters. "Remember what we practiced. You're not apologizing for your career gap. You're explaining your valuable experience." I smoothed my black blazer new, bought with money from the settlement, and took a deep breath. The job was with a mid-sized marketing firm in Buckhead, a senior designer position that would finally let me use the skills I'd kept sharp through freelance work while raising Jessica. The interview went better than I dared hope. The creative director, a woman named Lisa who was about my age, looked through my portfolio with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Your freelance work shows real versatility, she said, pausing at a logo design I'd created for a local nonprofit. And your availability for full-time work? Complete, I answered without hesitation. My daughter is in college now, and I'm ready to fully invest in my career again. Can I ask about the gap in your formal employment history? This was the question I dreaded, but Jessica's coaching kicked in. I chose to work part-time while raising my daughter and supporting my ex-husband's career. During that time, I maintained my skills through freelance projects and continued education. Now I'm excited to bring that experience and maturity to a full-time role. Lisa smiled. Experience and maturity are exactly what we need. When can you start? 3 weeks later, I was settling into my own office small, but with a window that looked out over the Atlanta skyline. My first project was rebranding for a chain of independent bookstores, and diving into the creative work felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. How's the corporate life treating you? Patricia asked when we met for lunch a month into my new job. We become friends through the divorce process, bonding over shared experiences of rebuilding after major life changes. Better than I expected, I admitted, picking at my salad. I was worried I'd be too old, too out of practice. But it's amazing how much I retained, and how much the life experience actually helps with client relationships. And David? Any word from the ex-husband front? I shook my head. Nothing since the final papers were signed. Jessica sees him occasionally, but she says he seems different. Distant, even with her. Regret has a way of changing people, Patricia observed. Not that it matters to you anymore. She was right. The sharp pain of betrayal had faded into something more like pity. David had gotten what he wanted: freedom from our ordinary life, a young girlfriend who admired his success, no more suburban responsibilities. But from what Jessica told me, he didn't seem particularly happy with his choices. Meanwhile, I was discovering what happiness looked like for me as an individual, not just as someone's wife or someone's mother. The revelation came 3 months into my new job during a presentation to a major client. I was explaining a campaign concept, completely in my element, when I realized something startling. I was enjoying myself. Not just professionally, but personally. I liked the woman. I was becoming confident, self-sufficient, valued for her own contributions, rather than her ability to support someone else's dreams. That evening, I called Jessica at school. "Mom, you sound different," she said after I told her about the successful presentation. "Different how?" "Happy. Like really happy. Not just putting on a brave face, happy, but actually happy." She was right. Somewhere in the process of rebuilding my life, I'd found something I'd lost years earlier without even realizing it myself. The final closure came unexpectedly, 6 months later. I was leaving the office late one evening, working on a campaign that had me genuinely excited, when I saw David in the parking garage. He looked older, somehow still handsome in his expensive suit, but there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during our marriage. "Rebecca," he said, his voice uncertain. "I wasn't sure. I heard you were working in the building." "David." I felt remarkably calm, standing there facing the man who'd once been the center of my entire world. "How are you?" "Good. Fine. You look—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You look well." "Thank you. I am well." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with everything we'd never be able to say to each other. "I heard about your promotion," he said finally. "Jessica mentioned you're leading the creative department now." "Associate creative director." I corrected mildly. It had happened 2 months earlier, after my campaign for the bookstore chain had won a regional advertising award. That's wonderful. I always knew you were talented. The words might have meant something a year ago. Now they just felt hollow. Too little and far too late. "I should go," I said, not unkindly but not lingering either. "Take care of yourself, David." "Rebecca, wait." Something in his voice made me turn back. He looked vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our divorce proceedings. "I wanted you to know. I realize I handled things badly. The way I treated you, the things I said. It wasn't fair. An apology. After all these months, an actual apology." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means something." "Does it?" He stepped closer, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd once loved. "Because I've been thinking, About us, about what we had. Maybe we moved too fast. Maybe if we tried counseling, or... No. The word came out more firmly than I'd expected, but without anger. David, what we had was real, and it was good for a long time. But it's over. He looked stunned, as if he'd expected me to fall apart at the suggestion of reconciliation. The old Rebecca might have. The woman who'd cried over divorce papers and begged him to remember what we'd once meant to each other. I don't understand, he said. You fought so hard to save our marriage. You said you loved me. I did love you. I loved you enough to build my entire life around supporting yours. But I also love myself enough now not to go back to someone who threw our life away the moment it felt inconvenient. But Vanessa and I, that's over. It didn't work out. Of course it didn't. I felt a brief flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, but it passed quickly. Their relationship failing didn't vindicate me, my own success did. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. But it doesn't change anything between us. Rebecca, please. We could start over. We could. David. I interrupted him gently but firmly. I'm not the same woman who cried in our kitchen while you called our marriage a prison. I've built a life I'm proud of, a career that fulfills me, a sense of myself that doesn't depend on being someone's wife. I wouldn't trade that to go back to being the woman you took for granted. The truth of it settled over me as I spoke the words. This wasn't about punishing David or proving a point. It was about recognizing that I'd become someone better, stronger, more complete than I'd been even in the best days of our marriage. You've changed, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. I have, and I like who I've become. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something like recognition dawn in his eyes. Maybe he was finally seeing the woman Judge Morrison had seen in that courtroom, someone who'd acted with dignity even when her world was falling apart, someone who'd rebuilt herself into something even better than she'd been before. I made a mistake, he said finally. Yes, you did, but it led us both to where we needed to be. I meant it. Standing there in that parking garage, looking at the man who'd once been everything to me, I felt nothing but calm certainty about the path my life had taken. The pain he'd caused me had been real and devastating, but it had also forced me to discover strengths I'd never known I possessed. Take care, David, I said again, and this time I walked away without looking back. Driving home through the familiar streets of Atlanta, I thought about the woman I'd been a year and a half ago. She defined herself through her relationships, as David's wife, as Jessica's mother, as a supportive partner who made everyone else's dreams possible while quietly setting aside her own. That woman had been good and loving and worthy of respect. But the woman I'd become was something more, independent, professionally successful, personally fulfilled. I'd learned to love myself with the same fierce devotion I'd once reserved for others. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. How did the client presentation go? And don't forget you have that art gallery opening tomorrow night. I smiled, thinking about tomorrow's event, a show by local artists that I was attending not as someone's plus one, but because I genuinely loved art and wanted to support the creative community I was now part of. Small things, maybe, but they represented a freedom I'd never fully appreciated when I'd had it before. At home in my cozy apartment, I poured a glass of wine and stood on my small balcony, looking out over the city lights. The view from here was different from the one we'd had from our suburban house, more urban, more dynamic, more full of possibility. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, displaying the campaign I'd been working on. Tomorrow I'd present it to a client who valued my expertise and creativity. Next week I'd interview candidates for my expanding team. Next month I'd attend a design conference in San Francisco, my first business trip in over 20 years. All of it was mine. Built by me, for me, with no one else's approval required. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Jessica's face appeared on the screen, calling from her dorm room. Hey, sweetheart, I answered. How was your day? Good, but I wanted to check on you. Dad texted me that he saw you today. He seemed, I don't know, weird about it. We ran into each other at work, I said carefully. Jessica didn't need to hear about her father's attempt at reconciliation. It was fine. Civil. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? I mean really happy? Because sometimes I feel guilty about how everything worked out. Like, you and Dad got divorced partly because of decisions you made about raising me, and now you're starting over at 46. My heart ached for her, this wonderful young woman who somehow felt responsible for the choices adults had made. Jessica, listen to me carefully, I said, settling into my favorite chair by the window. Every choice I made about my career, about prioritizing our family, about supporting your father, I made those choices because I loved you both, and they were the right choices for me at the time. The divorce happened because your father decided our life together wasn't enough for him. That had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with him. But now you're having to rebuild everything. And I'm loving it, I interrupted, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. Sweetheart, I am happier now than I've been in years. Maybe happier than I've ever been, because this happiness is mine. I built it, I earned it, and no one can take it away from me. Really? Really? You know what I realized today? I spent 23 years of my life trying to make someone else happy, trying to be the perfect wife and mother and supporter. And that wasn't wrong. I love doing those things. But I never asked what would make me happy as an individual person. And now you know. I looked around my apartment, at the work I was passionate about, at the life I'd constructed from the ground up after losing everything I thought mattered. Now I know, I confirmed. And it turns out, I'm pretty good at making myself happy. Jessica laughed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. I'm proud of you, Mom. Like, really proud. You're kind of badass. Language, young lady, I said in mock seriousness, then laughed. But thank you. I'm pretty proud of me, too. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The woman who'd cried over divorce papers in a suburban kitchen felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. The woman who'd sat in that sterile conference room, listening to her husband dismiss their entire marriage as a series of poor choices, seemed like a character from someone else's story. Judge Morrison had been right when she'd said I deserved better than what I'd received. But more importantly, I'd learned that I deserved better for myself. I deserved to be the protagonist of my own story, not just a supporting character in someone else's. The Atlanta skyline twinkled beyond my window, full of lights and life and possibility. Somewhere out there, David was probably in his downtown condo, maybe wondering what his life would look like if he hadn't blown up everything good about it. Somewhere out there, other women were facing the same crossroads I'd faced, deciding whether to rebuild or simply survive. I hope they chose to rebuild. I hope they chose to discover what they were capable of when they stopped defining themselves by their relationships and started defining themselves by their own dreams and ambitions and desires. As for me, I had a campaign to finish, a team to lead, and a life to live, a life that was entirely, authentically, joyfully mine. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.